One of the most unique images of the Second World War is that of the carry and use of swords by Imperial Japanese officers and soldiers. In a conflict which saw the rise of many new weapons and technologies, revolutionizing the face of modern warfare, the sight of swords being carried into battle often stands out as an anachronism. Indeed, their very image harkens back to the bygone age of the samurai, yet still, Japan clung to them. However, it is the topic of Imperial Japan's reclaiming of the sword I wish to examine here today. How did the iconic weapon of the warrior class survive and find its place in the hands of soldiers still roughly 70 years after the supposed fall of the samurai? Swords in military tradition have become a ceremonial staple over time, far beyond when they were considered conventional weapons of warfare. And while swords themselves are of great importance to those who are awarded them and carry them on significant occasions, one could say there is a great difference between how swords are viewed in many parts of the world. And in particular, there is perhaps no other country in the world who holds swords in such high regard as Japan. For roughly 7 centuries, Japan came to be dominated by a warrior class which we today have come to commonly refer to as the samurai. It is their story and legacy which is of course the main focal point of my channel. Now, Japanese swords, known as Nihonto, have become iconic. In particular, styles such as the tachi, katana, and wakizashi. The popular image of the samurai is one carrying 2 swords, known as daisho, one longer sword and one shorter sword, something which actually became mandated by the military government of the Tokugawa shogunate during the Edo period. By this point, swords had become a symbol of warrior status, and anyone from the lower classes, or commoners for that matter, were forbidden to own or carry them. Such was the decree of the Taiko Toyotomi Hideyoshi in 1588, with his infamous sword hunt. Prior to this point, swords were owned much more freely by many individuals, which is one of the many reasons why it is more difficult today to perhaps distinguish who was really considered samurai and who wasn't prior to the Edo period. Yet, as we know, swords were not the main weapon of the samurai for many centuries, as spears and bows were far more frequently used in warfare. It wasn't until the Edo period that we can argue swords truly came into their prominence as the main weapon of the warrior class. Now, before I go in too deep, I should mention that I have made a separate video all about the history of swords in Japan, one which I actually plan to update at some point, being that it has been some years since it was released. However, if you want a more comprehensive deep dive into the history of Japanese swords, I recommend you check out that video. As for this one, I am obviously going to be focusing on the role of swords later in time. Still, we need to understand why swords hold such symbolic importance in Japan. Japanese swords were not only weapons, but also precious pieces of art, often made by master craftsmen of various schools and styles. Indeed, it became a hallmark for craftsmen to sign their name on the tong, like an artist would sign his name on a painting. But Japanese swords also hold a spiritual significance, one relating to the religion of Shinto. Colin Roach in his book on Japanese swords addresses this, saying, "It is important to note that according to Shinto beliefs, one may sense earthly kami, but not see or hear them. Many believe that a samurai sword has the power to inspire its owner, imbuing its own energy into its possessor. The blade is also an unnerving and mysterious thing. In the context of Shinto and Japanese culture, this is seen as a manifestation of the kami within the sword. This is understood by Shinto practitioners to be proof of its power as both a metaphor and a tool." So as one can see, from a legacy such as this, it is no secret why swords in Japan were passed down generation after generation, many blades going beyond being just simple weapons and transcending into culturally significant and spiritual artifacts. Still, the sword remained the symbol of the samurai throughout the Edo period, right up until its end. Throughout the Edo period, a period characterized by its relative peaceful status, many samurai lost sense of their warrior identity and evolved into bureaucrats and other professions, while others still clung to their martial roots, training hard at various schools of swordsmanship in aims to maintain their fighting prowess. This is also the age in which kendo arose, thought of as a more efficient means of training, allowing individuals armed with bamboo swords known as shinai and wearing padded protection to spar with one another in ways where you couldn't in other training methods. By the end of the period, we reached the Bakumatsu era, the end of the Bakufu military government. It had begun with the opening of Japan's borders once again to the west, allowing in new ideas and technologies, but also destabilizing the country in ways which perhaps were never quite foreseen. Significant clans and domains throughout western Japan began to seek an end to the shogunate and a restoration of the emperor to full power. This led to various clashes and assassinations, eventually resulting in a civil war. Swords and swordsmen had of course played an active role during this time, but their achievements can often be hard to recognize, due to the fact that during this time many of Japan's most significant domains were undergoing rapid military modernization. Where previously many foot soldiers had been armed with antiquated styles of firearms, now modern rifles from the west were finding their way into the hands of infantrymen. Both those loyal to the old Tokugawa shogunate and those loyal to the emperor raced to advance their armies. Yet in the end, those supporting the emperor and the new government won by 1869. Both sides had begun to adopt many European styles within their new militaries, and by the end of the war, this was extremely evident. As the army of the new imperial government came into fruition, it was heavily westernized. And this is extremely significant for swords in particular, because it is also where we see the only ever major departure Japan took from their traditional style of swords, instead embracing a European style of saber. There was a conscious phasing out of old swords, specifically aimed at erasing the imagery of the newly abolished samurai class, which, at the time, Japan wanted to move on from, as to instead appear as more modern. As Ronald Heiferman described it, although many of the Meiji leaders were themselves of samurai origin, they recognized the need for certain egalitarian measures in order to fashion the new society they wished to create, and took them without hesitation, although considerable problems were created in doing so. In 1876, a further step was taken to remove old swords from any public spaces, as the Haitore decree was issued, banning any non-military or non-police personnel from wearing swords. This topic of the ban had actually arisen as early as 1869, yet was delayed, as many in the new government were nervous that such an action would destroy the spirit of the samurai, and as such, the power of the new imperial nation. Yet, with the rise of universal conscription, the time was finally seen as right to remove this old privilege. This move was one which continued to anger many disaffected former samurai who were not part of or in support of the new government. In 1877, a portion of angry former samurai rallied around Saigo Takamori, a great imperial commander of the Boshin War, who now positioned himself against certain policies of the new government. He would initiate the short-lived Satsuma Rebellion, something many view today as the last stand of the samurai. Yet, in reality, it was not so simple. Takamori wasn't advocating for a massive return of samurai status. He was more just disgruntled with the new government. Additionally, many leaders of the new imperial army themselves were former samurai. Thus, we can rather view this conflict as a clash between two separate groups of samurai, with different ideas on what the future of the new government should be. What is interesting about this conflict, though, is how both sides fought. Saigo's forces were recorded to have been more efficient in close combat situations when they occurred on the battlefield. Thus, the imperial army sought means to better defend against devastating charges from the rebels. What came to be was the Batotai, or Drawn Sword Squad, a group of police armed with katana, who were notably experienced swordsmen. Their role would help pave the way for the continued usage of swords, or rather wooden swords, by Japanese police, who would practice kenjutsu as it was seen as a necessary skill for police to have at the time. However, the same was not necessarily thought of for the army, who instead moved away from Kenjutsu and began inviting European fencing instructors for their own needs. The need for old-style swords finally began to wane more considerably as we moved deeper into the age of Imperial Japan. This unfortunately meant the decline of old schools of sword craftsmanship across the country. It is important to note, however, that Nihonto made following the Meiji Restoration and throughout much of the imperial years were known as Gendaito, modern swords. But while this is the term used to define blades during this time, it would be a while before the Japanese army once again embraced a Japanese style of sword. For the most part, swords made for military personnel during the years of Imperial Japan are known as Gunto, military swords. And it should be noted that later we'll get into differences between newer designs and older designs. Still, there were many different styles of these swords created, and although I'd love to go through all of the unique intricacies which arose over the years, it's unfortunately not the purpose of this video. However, this may be a topic I will return to in more detail, as I've recently purchased a copy of Swords of the Emperor by John Plimpton, and it would be fun to explore many of these designs more in depth. Yet, strictly for the topic of this video, what is important to understand is the shift in which Japan undertook to develop swords emulating Western styles, yet with notable Japanese influences and ornamentation. Swords remained a staple feature for not only the military, but as I mentioned, also the police, aristocrats, and many other forms of civil servants. And while decorative swords served their purpose fine for those not actually seeing battle, for military officers who would be involved in conflict, some of the shortcomings of these new designs began to emerge. For one was the length of the handle. Although the military had tried to adopt Western styles of fencing, in close combat situations, many Japanese soldiers would apparently resort to using two hands with their swords, something obviously difficult with one-handed sabers. This paved the way for newer designs which featured longer handles which could be used more effectively with two hands as desired. Additionally, further improvements to the blades were made to increase their durability, especially in colder climates, such as in Manchuria. It is clear that from such innovations, swords continue to be actively used by soldiers well past the point in which many other modern nations ceased using them. Yet this was by no means a hindrance to Japan, but rather an iconic feature of their military. Indeed, in many depictions of the Russo-Japanese War, swords are prominently on display. World War I was of course a defining conflict for the face of evolving warfare, a war which is often described as the first modern war. It featured the heightened use of devastating new technologies such as machine guns, airplanes, and tanks. Thus, it was an interesting time for melee combat. Although ranged weapons dominated battlefields, there were still moments of bloody and intense hand-to-hand struggles which would erupt, especially during the storming of trenches, where soldiers would utilize bayonets, clubs, daggers, and any other objects they could to crush their foes. These were characteristics of the infamous Western Front, however, and elsewhere during the war, combat took different forms. In Asia, Japan worked alongside the Allies to secure German colonial possessions, with perhaps their most famous triumph being that at the siege of Tsingtao, where they defeated a vastly inferior German garrison who bitterly defended their Chinese port. It was in the aftermath of the First World War, however, that things for Japan really started to take a sharp turn. During the Paris Peace Conference, which would result in such important developments as the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations was established. The League was of course a predecessor to the later United Nations, and whose goal was continued peace and stability around the globe. Japan was considered one of the great victors of the war, and thus was positioned to be one of the leading nations within the League, alongside that of the United Kingdom, France, and Italy. Japan's position was unprecedented as the first non-Western nation to be so highly regarded, and Japanese dignitaries felt this too, pushing for Japan to be officially considered as racial equals. And although this move was backed by several other great powers, countries such as the United Kingdom, Australia, Portugal, Belgium, and the United States refused such a notion. This single act would spur on resentment for decades. But it didn't stop there. In 1922, the Washington Naval Treaty, which involved Japan, the United States, United Kingdom, France, and Italy further showcased how the West was content to limit Japan's military capabilities. These two actions galvanized a growing nationalist movement in Japan, angered at the West's dismissal of Japan and ways in which they continue to box them in. These influences can be used to shed a great deal of light onto Japan's later actions, as David McCormick in his book Japan at War claims by stating, "Militarists and conservatives seized on the West's apparent stymieing of Japanese ambitions by taking direct political and military action aimed at ensuring economic security. Such security could in their view only be attained by maintaining and later expanding long-held economic privileges in China and Manchuria." The stage was being set for the Second World War in Asia, as nationalist sentiment in Japan began to boom, partly due to the actions of the West, but also as a reaction to a growing liberalism in Japan which emerged in the 1920s. The need to maintain traditional Japanese elements and values became a central focus in many areas of Japanese society, as well as in the military. On one hand, this came in the form of a reemergence of concepts like Bushido, the way of the warrior, a distorted and more modern idea of samurai values of honor and virtue, as well as the rise in popularity of samurai texts, such as the Hagakure, which gave a view into the mind of a samurai in the Edo period. Yet, one of the clearest of ways the Japanese military strived to return to their cultural roots was in regards to swords, as Japan would move away from the Western styles and once again embrace Japanese styles. In Swords of the Emperor, Plimpton addresses this change in style, how it came about, and how these new swords would evolve. At the beginning of hostilities with China in the Showa era, the conservative nationalist military authorities attempted to reawaken the military spirit of the nation epitomized by the samurai. They therefore commissioned swords to be made using traditional materials and methods at the Yasukuni Shrine and Minatogawa Shrine. They also specified a design for the mounts which copied the form seen on traditional Japanese swords, thus moving away from Western influence. As hostilities increased, it was impossible to meet the need for swords using only traditional production methods. As a result, a number of arsenals were created which produced swords. The products of these arsenals were made to look like traditional blades, but were generally made from imported raw material using a broad range of different manufacturing techniques, which enabled them to be produced in large quantities. Following this point, Western styles became known as Shin Gunto, old military sword, while the newer designs of traditional Japanese inspiration were known as Shin Gunto, new military swords. Although, like the prior generation, there would be numerous swords crafted in this style for all manner of roles, the four most prominent designs which made their way into the hands of the military were that of the Type 94, Type 95, Type 98, and the naval variants. We will be mostly focusing on the swords made for the Army here. The Type 94 was first introduced in 1934 and was the highest quality sword received by the Army. It was designed for higher-ranking officers and was apparently paid for by the officer himself or his family. The Type 95, introduced a year later in 1935, was overall similar at a glance, but quite different when taking a closer look. The Type 95 was mass-produced for non-commissioned officers, thus its overall quality and durability was inferior to that of the Type 94. Lastly for the Army was the Type 98, introduced by 1938. It made subtle differences from the original Type 94 and itself came to be mass-produced during the war, like the Type 95. It should be noted that each of these designs bore unique features which separated them, not only by status but also in terms of personalization. Sword quality remained rather consistent until the 1940s, when the situation for Japan began to severely worsen. This is likely where the idea that these were bad swords comes from. With less materials available, plenty of corners were cut when producing swords later in the war, such as scabbards being made more cheaply and an overall reduction or complete lack of ornamentation. There was likely also a difference in the quality of the metal used in the blade. Still, there is a belief that many military swords produced around this time were said to surpass the quality of older swords. Yet, I don't think this has ever been properly tested, so it is hard to confirm the truth of the matter. What it likely comes down to is which model it was and when it was produced. There is another question, though, which needs to be answered. How much were these swords actually used during the Second World War? Obviously, we are just referring to those who would have participated in actual combat, and not higher-ranking commanders. Based on video and photography we have, it would be hard to discern the frequency of usage, as well as in what way. On one hand, there is plenty of evidence which shows swords in the hands of officers during what appears to be actual engagements. And then, of course, there are the pictures of swords being used during executions, a brutal aspect of the war which harkens right back to the samurai culture of head-taking. Yet, this is a topic we are going to avoid today, as the war crimes and other atrocities the Imperial Japanese Army committed are not what I am covering in this video. Instead, the question remains focused on swords being used in actual combat situations. Antony Cummins, in his book Samurai Death Cult, which explores darker aspects of samurai culture, touches on this topic. Sword combat and killing with a samurai sword was performed on a mass scale in the 20th century, possibly even more so than during some parts of samurai history. The book Tataku Nihonto, written by author Naruse Kanji, contains testimonials from Japanese soldiers who had killed various people with swords during World War II. Cummins then goes on to quote several of the testimonials from Kanji's book. And what stands out here are how many of these quotes discuss practical combat usage of the sword and how it differs from that of kendo techniques. This is likely because, by this point, the Imperial Japanese military had begun to adopt some hand-to-hand combat training skills using some concepts and styles from kendo. Some of these quotes are as follows. To kill an enemy in actual fighting, the distance to the enemy has to be much closer than in kendo. Distance in kendo is just not practical. The current form of kendo, with bamboo swords, forms only the basics of budo, and does not work as a real military technique. To acquire practical military skill, one has to learn sword drawing with real swords and perform sword-cutting tests. Also, the mental training required to overcome the fear of death is important. An officer who killed 47 people said sword drawing and running ability were essential for real fighters. He was also very much against kendo, because in kendo they teach you to target difficult parts to cut, such as the torso, wrists, and thrust towards the throat. According to that soldier, the easiest part to cut on an enemy coming at you is the shoulder, and the easiest part to thrust is the chest or belly. He also said, in fighting, if you can see the situation, you will win. Now, I am by no means trying to discredit kendo. I myself am a big fan of kendo. But modern kendo has obviously become sportified. Thus, it would make sense why soldiers seeing actual combat might have certain opinions about how to engage opponents in real life-or-death situations. But what I feel these writings really depict is how often swords were actually used during the war while in battle. It appears clear that using the sword in close combat situations was a frequent enough occurrence, at least from these and other first-hand accounts. And I wouldn't be surprised to discover if some soldiers may have even gone out of their way to purposefully use their swords in combat. But it certainly is a surprising thing to consider that during a war which featured machine guns, tanks, planes, and many other modern weapons, that the sword was still used to some degree. Of course, though, Japan would lose the war, and those carrying swords would surrender them to Allied forces, turning over their prized blades to the enemy in defeat. During the U.S. occupation of Japan, the forging of swords was banned, and many swords themselves were either turned over or looted by occupation forces. The unfortunate reality is that not just Gunto were lost during this time, but also many other historic or culturally significant blades as well, as U.S. military personnel often didn't understand the difference. It would not be until 1953 when sword making in Japan was allowed to resume. These newly made swords were once again meticulously made by various craftsmen who upheld old traditional methods of smithing. New Japanese swords were no longer mass-produced, and especially not for the military. Truly, I think it is fair to say that the samurai sword ended its actual practical usage in 1945. Although Nihonto are still made to this day, they are no longer weapons of war, but instead tools of martial arts and beautifully crafted works of art. It can be argued that there is no other type of sword in the world that has such a significant legacy, spanning hundreds of years, going from medieval to modern times. And in the age of rising Japanese nationalism in the 1930s, it was Japan's reclaiming of their swords that defined their embrace for the warrior culture who ruled the country for centuries. So, when we see photographs and videos of swords being used by Imperial Japanese forces during the Second World War, it is important to remember the reasoning as to why such a significant symbol remained in the hands of the Japanese military. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.